How'd you first get involved in the plant space, be it nursery production and then later on academia?
That's a good question. It's an atypical start. I was a teenager in Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, a little west of Philadelphia, and I wanted a job when I was a teenager, and I didn't have a driver's license yet, so I had to find a company I could walk to or run to. And there was a nursery growing plants down the road, so I got a job there. And as an early teenager, 14 years old, started growing plants and fell in love with plants, how they grew. And I had a million questions, very quickly about them. So that was the start, a summer job as a teenager.
Are any of those questions you had early on curiosities that you carried through life that you've now been able to answer through your experience in academia at Cal Poly or elsewhere?
Yes, the answer to that is yes, however, with a caveat. So the yes is many of the questions I had, I now have answers to. For instance, why is it that we prune a particular plant a certain way? Or why do we select a particular type of soil or substrate for a crop? But what I found is for every question that I answer, I replace it with probably about five new ones. So that's what I love about working with plants, teaching, researching, is that I learn something new every day. And that has been really fun.
This is usually something I ask towards the end, but it came up now, so I think it's appropriate. If there was one question in your field of experience or knowledge that you don't know the answer to it, and if you could have that answer, it would unlock so much. Is there a question that comes to mind?
That is an excellent question. Because I'm in California and water is so important, I believe some of the complexity of water efficiency about how you can time the delivery of water, match the characteristics of the soil or a substrate and the water, light levels, nutrients, all of those things. But the ability to really maximize water efficiency with a plant, and it really is, maybe it's a cop out because it's not one specific question, but it's a better understanding of all those dynamics. Because I find as soon as I feel comfortable in one area, I realize there's part of the equation I'm missing in water efficiency. So I think it would be related to water use in plants.
When you think about plants, let's say in the nursery from your experience there, there's an immense amount of technology in modern nursery operations, from seeding to potting up, all sorts of equipment. Do you think our understanding of what you just mentioned, plants, not basic physiology, we know if you plant a seed, hey, it's going to sprout cotyledons, then true leaves, and it grows. But are we operating on a higher knowledge base in terms of the exact right media for the exact crop with the exact right fertility and the exact right water? Are we there yet with technology compared to where we were, say, 50 or 100 years ago? Or are we still kind of doing the same thing just with modern tools?
That's a really good question. I would say we've come far. I do believe we've come very far, and there's a lot that we understand. However, there are times where I believe it becomes very inefficient commercially to dwell on some questions and over ask them. You have to move forward. You have to grow your crop. You have to pick something and go. And so I think there is so much room for improvement, whether it is the timing of how we deliver nutrients or maybe very specific blends of components in a substrate as we maximize porosity of it might be choosing between different components and even container size or shape and how we supply the water, whether it's through a dripping system, right, or a sub irrigation or overhead irrigation, and then all the complexities of in the nursery industry, choosing to irrigate in a sub irrigation system has consequences in terms of harvest, right? And the same is true of micro irrigation. We put all these drip emitters on our crops. When you go to harvest, it's a pain. You have to remove all the emitters. You have to stop them. You have to step through the spaghetti tubing, right, or all the connections. So there are consequences for wanting to be water efficient in that particular setting. And I feel like as we look at production in the industry, we've come so far, but in some cases we found something that worked, and now we move forward and we pay our bills, right? We make our profit where we're at. And what I'm seeing with climate change, with water shortage, with these pressures coming that are bigger than something that is small that you can think of in 1 year or in 1 month, we're being forced to consider some of these things. Supply chain interruptions, consumer awareness of issues where they boycott products or they change their mind about what they want to buy. Those things are forcing innovation and change, which is expanding our knowledge, which is really exciting.
What's been the biggest change you've seen over the past 20 years?
20 years. I believe one of the things that has changed for me personally was early in my time in the nursery industry, when you started looking at a substrate for growing plants, they were pretty basic, centered around peat and very often perlite. And now I see coir, being used to such extreme lengths, or core, depending upon who you're talking to. I see other forms of compost. I see really interesting substrates that are so different than what I worked with. And then stacking onto that is container technology, where we've gone from just the original old food containers being used as containers to now incredible technology with air pruning and root architecture being a major factor. Really cool to see that innovation.
When you look at it in the nursery, there's a lot of things encompassed in a potting mix. You have water holding capacity, you have the inherent nutrients in that media, whether they're added or you like compost is going to have some nutrients to it versus like seed mix with fertilizer added to it. You
Mm-hmm.
have porosity, water holding capacity, you have organic matter content, and then you have the type of organic matter. When you start to lump all these different variables, they're all like little dials, right, that you can tweak to get the optimum mix. If you're thinking very broad, are there things we know now of, if you're looking at a nursery mix, these are the things you want to get right?
Mm. Yeah, that is a good question. I think some growers have had their paradigm changed a bit in this past year, and that is availability has risen to the top. It was always there, it always mattered. But for a long time, many growers I talked to, they could get what they wanted. If they wanted peat, they could get peat. If they wanted perlite, they could get perlite. And what we saw in the pandemic and even leading up to the pandemic were peat shortages and shortages of components that were formerly quite reliable. So I believe as you start looking at all those factors, the desire to have something that you can count on, that's going to be there the day you want to pot your crop, that's really, really important. Porosity, I believe, is really driving all this. You talk about that airspace, the space that's available for oxygen and for water and nutrient holding and I guess less nutrient holding root growth, so critical. And I think those things, cost is going to be a driver as you start asking. We can sub things out. We can look at water holding and we can say there are different components that can fill that niche. So when we look at soil, I enjoy teaching classes and talking to students about, well, what's different between a soil and a soilless substrate, right? Or an artificial media or artificial substrate. I like that term better because you can use soil in a soilless substrate, as a small component. And so as we look at an artificial substrate, how is it different? And you take a field, a nice field setting, as in like a landscape field, right? There are trees, there are shrubs, there are grasses, and you look at porosity and you're sitting at 50% or maybe a little bit under. Walk into a greenhouse where someone is growing a crop you're going to pick up at a garden center, and it's sitting at 80 to 95% porosity, just a different world compared to that natural field setting. And so our goal is to have this hyper productive production setting in a container. So porosity is a driver. We need it. It's got to be there, but we have to be able to find what we want. So as a teacher, as an instructor, my goal is to help my students know big picture principles that you talked about, all these things we can look at, organic matter and mineral-based matter. But when it comes down to is the chemical and physical properties, and then saying, how do I look at what's available to me? How do I find what is cost effective? And how do I put that together to have a high performing substrate for my crop?
So let's say the optimum porosity for a given thing we're growing is X. Is it more important about getting to X versus versus the makeup of materials that make X happen? So let's
Mm.
say you could just get X porosity using peat. Is that going to perform the same as if you mixed in perlite, vermiculite, peat, and compost, and you were still at X?
That's a really good question as well. Part of this comes down to if we're thinking about pore space and we want to hold water, we want to hold oxygen, we want root growth. We've got to understand that some of that pore space is going to fill up with water readily and hold it. Some is going to maintain oxygen. So the answer to your question would be it's not all the same. We want some that is going to not hold water completely. You take a purely peat-based mix that has a good wetting agent or is very quick to hold water, and it will get really heavy and wet when you irrigate that substrate. You add in a little bit of perlite where it doesn't tend to hold on to water excessively. You're still going to have airspace oxygen for respiration after irrigation. Now, the thing that's interesting is you can have, quote unquote, the wrong substrate if you dial in your irrigation appropriately. So there are times where you might have a substrate, a grower will tell you that holds too much water, that will not grow a good crop. If you know what you're doing when you irrigate, you can probably work with it. You can make it work, but it might be very dangerous if you're exposed to rain or you can't control the amount of water carefully. So when we're talking about this porosity idea, yes, there would be this big difference between will that substrate hold excessive amounts of water and become very saturated, very, very, very wet, or will it maintain some oxygen right after irrigation? And this is where oftentimes, you go into a garden center and they're selling you a mix designed for succulents or designed for certain water sensitive crops. It's going to have a lot of that porosity that's not going to hold excessive water. Whereas you take others, they're going to soak up water like a sponge and be incredibly heavy after irrigation.
How much does container size play a factor in success? I was at a event last year and I was kind of blown away. I was talking to somebody about broccoli starts and they were growing them in 578 cell trays.
Mm.
So, I mean, like tiny, tiny. And this is kind of up your way, so for stuff for growing in the Central Valley, like mega farm type things. And they're in there for like 35 days. And as a
Mm.
gardener, I mean, I kind of looked at the cell and like, oh my God, that's too small. And I'm thinking like, hey, this thing needs to be swimming in soil. But they're doing this on a big scale. They're very economically motivated to be successful. They've done, thousands and thousands and thousands of trials at this scale. So, hey, it must work for them. But yet intuitively, you're like, hey, that's too small. What are your thoughts on container size at like a seeding stage?
That's a good question. What I think about a lot is what I'm asking the root system to do for me, in the crop. So a broccoli, you're looking at a crop that's going to go out and transplant. You're going to get it into probably a well-drained soil, and you want that to grow pretty vigorously. And so you'd be thinking pretty carefully about the speed. You talk about 30 some days or, turning that around quickly, stopping the roots from doing a lot of circling or from developing poor architecture in a tiny space. When I'm growing a tree crop, we grow oaks sometimes here on the Central Coast, some of our Central Coast live oak and some of our classic native plants. We want to think really carefully about that root architecture because you have this plant in a native environment, has incredible drought tolerance and fits the climate well. But if you grow it in the wrong container and you grow the wrong shape root system on that plant, it will not be, a match for the ecosystem. And so in that case, we look at very deep containers to allow the taproot to grow down in the plant. We want to be really cautious about, and this is where it becomes a little interesting. If you want to grow this in a landscape environment, like, someone in their front yard, they're going to have modified soil. They want to grow it as a shade tree. You might actually go through and either air prune or physically prune the root system and get it to branch, because that tree is going to be in an artificial environment where it will be cared for like a landscape plant. If you want to do a restoration planting, I would want to be really careful about making sure the taproot was not pruned, that it stayed intact, and that you would get the natural taproot in the root system. So my long-term goal for the use of the plant might influence the type of container I would select, in starting the plant. For something small like a bedding plant, right now, I think a strong driver is what's the goal in terms of automation? What kind of machine will be transplanting it, or person, if that's the case, but how quickly do you need to transplant? And I found when I was growing plants back, it's now, I guess, been the late 90s where I was doing lots of crops in the early 2005, 2004. We would often look at the speed to fill out the cell as the determining factor. So we would want based on our projection for where we were doing transplanting, we would pick our cell size to a good root system in the 4 weeks or the 3 weeks or whatever time frame runway we had to get to that point. The goal being avoiding a pot-bound or root-bound plant where there's not enough porosity left in the container. The roots have replaced the porosity, and then it becomes very high maintenance, in a greenhouse setting. So we would look to match that sizing based on our production schedule. So I would jump between a 32, a 36, a 48, a 72, a 144, all those plug sizes based on what I expected the timeline to be to transplant.
What's visibly noticeable on a root bound plant versus a cell that's well filled out?
That's a good question as well. So what I would look at is if I guess part of this depends if I'm thinking as a homeowner, as a grower in that case, as if you're looking at a plant and trying to determine pot bound versus not pot bound, one big giveaway is you see signs of extreme stress of just the plant can't get enough water, maybe showing signs of nutrient stress. And that is simply there is not porosity left in that cell, to support the plant. As I look at the plug, what I would warn people about going to a garden center and buying a plant for their landscape is, take a look. A lot of garden centers really don't want you pulling plants out of pots. I found it's best to ask an associate there. Hey, could I see the root system? They might be shocked. A lot of people probably don't ask that question. But if you know what you're doing and you work with trees and shrubs and containers, it's easy to pop them out and, show a root system, as long as we're not talking about a massive tree box or something, or, balled and burlap plant. But if you can see the root system, what you're looking for are roots that come out to the edges of the container, but don't do a lot of circling or excessive doubling back over each other. When you're looking at them, some people would say, well, more is better. I want to see roots in the whole root ball. What I would look for is not that, but rather lots of potential growth points. You want to see almost like, hands extending out at the edge of the plant, where you're seeing all these areas that can grow. Some of the new air pruning pots are amazing. You see them come out of that pot and you just see growth points all up and down that root ball. Is so great to see. I don't remember seeing anything like that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and absolutely beautiful root systems. So I would look to avoid that circling root system, and then really look for signs of stress on the above, the part of the plant you can see above ground.
Yeah, it's like some of those round pots that have like the feet that come down with little recesses, and sometimes you pull the plant out and you can see the roots have 100% conformed up and down to the shape from so much circling there that they've essentially molded the inside of the pot.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. And then if you are working with a plant that has a woody root system, it's going to be a long-term root system. That's where you'll see some books or, different recommendations will talk about cutting into the root system, cut those roots, but you want to create some new growth points and not have all those double backers. You talk about those pieces underneath. They're going to thicken up, develop secondary growth, and basically girdle themselves or choke themselves out based on that shape.
What are your thoughts on that, cutting it off? Because I've seen both sides. Some people be like, hey, it's just going to damage the plant. You're putting it at risk for disease or shock. When you do, let's say you don't have a choice, you get a plant and it's got that on it, all that root circling, is it better to shave the sides down and put it in to try and stimulate new growth, or just put it in as is?
Yeah, I would tend, for a woody plant, anything that has a woody root system that's going to be perennial year after year, I would tend to do some cutting on that for anything that's circling back, especially circling at the top. But even down lower at the bottom of the pot, if there are things going fully around, I would not tend to shave, everything on the entire plant, but make some vertical cuts, perhaps 4, 5, 6 lengthwise, around the container, and then kind of tease some of those root sections out to get, basically you want that finger extension, growing out of the plant. And if it was something that was an herbaceous plant, something that was a 1-season plant or a shorter timeline, sometimes in those cases I have not cut them, but I've just used my fingers to kind of pull apart a little bit in there and create some outgrowth into the planting hole. And that would be my tendency there. I believe very strongly in the planting hole is critical to success. And so I would really be cautious to promote exploration, in the root system, which would be avoiding smooth sides on the hole and any kind of clay in the soil, watching out for glazing, where if you just take a wet clay and rub your hand over it and you'll kind of create a smooth surface, roots will hit that and just work their way right around the container. So make sure, especially when I have a root system that's looking somewhat pot bound, make sure to have rough surfaces in the planting hole and not smooth sides.
And one thing I've heard before is don't over amend, let's say, the hole you're putting the plant into. So let's say I put in a 5-gallon tree, that the diameter of that pot is 8 inches. So I could dig an 8-inch hole and just drop it in. It's a 1-for-1 fit. It's just like it came out of the pot. So it's straight native soil right next to it. I could also, double it up and have a 16-inch diameter hole. So now there's a bunch of extra space around the side, or 32 inches. I go way bigger, throw all sorts of fluffy, loose soil in, native soil, and whatever else I have. But then I've heard people say then that just, it sets the plant up for failure in the long run, because now it's got this bigger hole with fluffy stuff. It doesn't go out. It's not forced to go out and explore more. Do you think that's valid?
I think there's truth in that. And once again, I would see a relationship to clay soil, where you're basically creating a pot in the ground, when you have that, dig that hole and the amendment. One thing that I would watch out for with amendment, and I would tend to side with being cautious about amending soil, especially in a small planting hole. One is with compost or some amendments. I spent time in Pennsylvania close to a lot of the mushroom industry, and we use mushroom compost often as an amendment, and it can be very high in salts. And so you'd end up with a very stressful environment in an amended planting hole when you had mushroom soil in the planting hole. What I tend to do personally is to say, if I have the luxury of amending a larger space, if I'm putting in a bed or a landscape bed, can I amend the entire bed? Can I go in and work some topsoil or compost into that so that the entire area is very favorable for root growth? That would be option one I would like to do. If I can't do that, what I would tend to do is dig a hole that I can fill up reliably. So I'm giving myself 6 inches, maybe around the full root zone. So I can make sure I get soil down around the plant. And then I make it look like a star is probably the wrong word, but I would take my shovel and cut irregular shapes pretty quickly. It's not formal. It's not an art project, but I want crevices and different shapes around to start that movement into the soil. And then I might, if the soil is really bad, I might do a very mild amendment, probably nothing too extreme, but just a little bit. In many cases, it would be the native soil right back into place. Where I live right now, I have a very sandy soil, and it's very uniform in the entire area I'm working with. So what I tend to do is amend a larger area, and I add compost in just to increase water holding, at least for the transplant establishment phase. And I do that.
One question regarding, you mentioned oaks, really shallow container narrow container. So more like a toilet paper tube versus a coffee can that somebody would be planting in. How does the taproot stay intact in those, since it could eventually bottom out? What happens when it gets to the bottom?
Yes, typically they will air prune. So you will lose that taproot when it reaches the very bottom of the container.
Okay. Jumping over one of the studies that I was reading that you did, biochar is a propagation substrate. People have heard a lot about biochar. There's a lot. It's something people love to promote. I've talked to a lot of people on this podcast in the past about it, so I have my views based upon them. What's your current view first of biochar as a agricultural input?
That's a good question. I would say that my attitude toward biochar has been a little dismaying to some companies that are selling biochar, and that is I'm still skeptical about the cost that comes with the product. I'm really excited about the concept of biochar. I love it. Love the idea of stabilizing carbon-based material, having it maintain its volume and be consistent and reliable. What I have concern about is by the time it goes through the processing to have a consistent pH and to have pore sizes that are predictable, it just becomes expensive relative to other things that could fill its niche. So in a production environment, it is, in a small container, we want it to be high performing. I sometimes call it designer biochar, really high performing biochar. And that's where I have concern about is economic sustainability right now, or being able to fit with a nursery. when it comes to being more informal and incorporating it in poor soil in a landscape environment or in an outdoor environment, even if you have a vegetable garden, on a property, I think it's really exciting in that phase because it's much more forgiving. It doesn't need to be so high performing and so consistent. So I love the idea. The reason I did the research I did was I was not seeing much tied to propagation, where you get small containers, small cell sizes, the effects are magnified. I was seeing more about fields and big containers, in larger growth environments. So that's why I did the research I did.
So if you take it and you put it in and say substitute for a perlite, vermiculite, something that adds that airspace to it, what are your thoughts if we throw costs out of the window? Everything costs the
Mhm.
same. You have
Yes.
biochar and other choices sitting in front of you. Post research, would you go for the biochar in the
I
mix?
I I would. There are, which might seem like a petty thing, but there's the one thing that I working with it is it stains. It is, as you're working with a fine char based project, this char does stain up your hands. It will stain up clothing if you get it on. And so when you're working with the product itself, once you get it into a substrate, it's not as much of an issue when you mix it with peat or mix it with other things. But in its raw form, in handling it, working with it, it was somewhat dirty, to work with. Now, I like getting my hands dirty, so that's not a big problem. But at the same time, if you're working with equipment, you're working in lab space. For instance, the lab where I did my research, after I'd be mixing the char, there would be light char dust, in on the benches and on the machinery that I was using that I have to clean up. The peat would leave very little residue, behind in that space. So there was that element that may be concerning, for a grower on a larger scale, but I really liked the performance. It was comparable to peat and to perlite in its performance. The only place that I saw a real difference was at very high rates, 80% char, and around that level, I was taking peat and perlite based substrates and amending them by volume percentage. So 20%, 40%, 60, 80. When I got up to 80%, I did start to see some differences in rooting of cuttings and also with growth of seedlings. And those changes are something that effectively cuttings were developing root systems that had a higher root count, so more roots initiated, but very small compared to the lower rates of biochar. So if I was going to visually depict it, with my hand, if I were to take a handout like this, would say, okay, this was the root system when I had a 20% char. When I went to 80%, it looked like this, but it had 4 times the roots, right, or 3 times the roots. So they were short and highly branched, but not extended and growing out. And I have not been able to explain what that is, chemical or physical, that led to that outcome. I tried a little follow up to understand it better, and didn't reach closure on that or have an answer to that. But if I avoided those very high rates, and that was intriguing, even if I get that high branching, could I do that to initiate all those roots and then maybe modify the substrate, or do a transplant and see a very dense root system? I found that intriguing. But the biggest drawback to me as a product would really be the cost at this point.
Is consistency an issue? That's one thing, I know from talking to some people, it's tough to study biochar because that's a classification, but that's an umbrella with a million things under it. What
Yes.
was it made out of? What is the pore space? What temperature was it pyrolyzed at? Where
Yes.
I would think perlite is perlite for the most part,
Mhm.
and it's more or less uniform, where when you get into biochar, it's not uniform and it can mean all different things. So the biochar you tested with could be completely different than what I use and try, and we could get different results.
That's a very good point. Yes, I think of biochar and soil, as being in kind of, if you're doing an apple to apple, biochar and soil, I think fits better than like a biochar perlite or biochar, even peat. Peat has some variability. You have hypnum peat and sphagnum peat and reed sedge peat, in different classifications, but they're still pretty similar, in how they operate.
So, starting to summarize this all up here, if somebody's thinking about plant propagation, and you talked about base principles or principles for success earlier on that you teach your students, what are the things that they want to think of? what are the most important things to focus on when you start thinking plant substrates?
Hmm. So I think the key is to know what plant you're working with and what its needs are. So if I'm growing a cutting, if I want a stem cutting and I'm growing that plant, I have to protect that cutting from drying out, right, before it can generate roots. So I need to be able to minimize transpiration stress, help keep that plant healthy. So what I want out of my substrate is, depending on the way I'm going to protect that cutting, I want it to do the job that needs to be done to allow roots to form. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I'm going to use a mist system, supplying mist over top to wet down the leaves and allow evaporation to cool the plant, just like sweat can, cool us when we're hiking or running. If I'm providing that misting layer and the water is constantly hitting my substrate, I've got to watch out for a substrate that holds a ton of water, that soaks it up like a sponge. And if I do that, I'm going to have lots of water in the rooting zone and no oxygen for respiration. So the plant will not be able to form roots in this really wet environment. So I probably want a substrate that will be well draining, hold a lot of oxygen. I want perlite. I want pumice. I want things that are going to drain well. If I'm going to use an enclosure where I'm going to trap water in a system and I'm going to keep it internal, I can then use a substrate that holds considerable water because I'm not going to keep adding water. I'm going to trap it in an enclosure, and I'm then going to be less susceptible to overhydrating my substrate. If I have a fogging system where I suspend little droplets, I can also use a substrate that holds a bit more water. That's okay because I'm not supplying the sheer volume like a mist system would over top. There are also differences between the type of crop I'm growing. They may be more or less forgiving of the amount of water in the root zone. So I want to identify what's around this plant. What am I trying to do in that space? For seed germination, I want to ask myself, what type of crop am I growing? Is it one that thrives with high water amounts and relatively little oxygen required for root growth, or is it one that needs considerable root growth? And often this will connect with a native environment. If you're looking at, does it come from a dry place or well-drained soil or very wet soils? Other times you can find it in a grower's handbook, but you're trying to identify how it is that you want to grow your crop. How wet is that interface with the seed? And so once you're thinking about the needs of your plant, and really the irrigation systems you have, whether it's sub-irrigation or mist or fogging or your handheld irrigation, then you're trying to pair that together with the substrates you have available to you. And then always in there is the cost and availability issue to continue to think about.
So even the best quote unquote media to grow in could be ruined by poor watering
Yes.
habits or mechanisms.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. I get asked by many people, why are my houseplants dying? Anytime I'm at a dinner party or anywhere, people know I'm a plant scientist and they have questions. And if there's not a lot of time, I will tell them the answer is water, and we can talk about it later. And it's generally overwater, underwater, salt accumulation, and light levels are sometimes an issue, but often it is humidity, even, in the growth space, in the house or wherever the plant's growing. And so you are so right. You could have the perfect substrate and then mess it up with the way water is delivered, nutrients are delivered, the temperature that you're growing at. There are so many things that can be a mismatch in the equation for growth and health in a plant.
If we look at annual plants, is there a mix that is most forgiving in the
Mm,
nursery for people? So for people that maybe aren't as precise on the watering, hey, at least if you go with a mix like this, it's going to make up for any mistakes that you have. I think people tend to probably, I don't know, maybe you agree or disagree, overwater versus underwater. So
exactly.
I'm thinking you want something that sheds more water than holds more.
I agree, and I think that's why we see so many mixes that have perlite and pumice, as a component, or even bark. Whereas you have a highly composted bark, it will hold quite a bit of water, but larger pieces of bark will not. And so things with large pieces of bark or chunks of bark or even wood, which will take some nutrients in the decomposition process. So that's a tricky balance. But if you've got some bark, pumice, perlite, it will be a lot more forgiving. It also is the reason that some of the pieces of advice, like water your plants with an ice cube, right? Putting an ice cube in a container versus pouring on water. Nothing magical about the ice cube or the cold water. It just slows down the water delivery rate. And so I know some people that will water orchids or other sensitive houseplants that way. they think it's magic or somebody told them and their plant started to live. It was simply somebody putting the brakes on their watering, and keeping them from overwatering their plant.
Yeah, it's like eating oranges versus guzzling orange juice, right? Like after
Exactly.
after a certain amount of time, you can only eat so many oranges, but you've consumed gallons of orange juice and all the calories that go with it.
It's so true. And the other thing I see too is water softeners. People will use water softeners in their water, adding all this sodium right to their water. And if you are putting that into your potted plants or your house plants, you'll notice at the top of the container, you'll see the salts accumulate right over time. As you water the plant, the water dries out, the salts accumulate on the top, and you're creating your own salt flats over time. Right on the top of the container. Every time you water, more of that salt goes into solution and enters. So every single watering, the amount of salt is building in that container.
One last question. Fertility. What are your thoughts for plants in containers for less than 30 days? How important is fertility in that mix?
Mm, that's a good question. So short time frame. I would tend to look at that as where they're headed. If they're going out into a field site where that's going to be managed like an agricultural crop, you're trying to grow a food product, or is it going into a landscape that you're not going to be adding a lot of nutrients? So if you do have a substrate that has some nutrition in it, you've got some compost perhaps in it or things that have nutrients, I would not apply large amounts of nutrients. As a grower, I love controlled release fertilizers. The classic brand is Osmocote, but I didn't use that brand in particular. But the controlled release technology where nutrients are released over time, we do low rates of that. And then when you have good growth conditions, you get some nutrient release. I would tend to use that in many of my crops. If it is a case of 30 days too, perhaps one or two water soluble feeds, of doing a water soluble fertilizer, might do that at the same time. But I'd probably make that decision based upon where the plant was headed, what the end user was going to be.
Great. And for any additional resources out there you'd recommend for people that want to learn more about nursery technology, more on the home scale, not the commercial scale?
Yeah. So if you're interested in learning, I would highly recommend checking out if in your state, if you're in the US and you have an extension office near you through the state university, I'd recommend taking a look at that or master gardeners. You can Google your state and master gardener and take a look at some of the networks that could be in your community. Another good way to learn is to check in at botanical gardens and nurseries and ask questions about growing plants. And usually they have a wealth of knowledge that will apply to your immediate community that can work out really well as well. And now, thanks to the power too of the internet, if you live in a town, Google that town and plants or gardeners, and very often there are groups that meet together, whether it is, a dahlia enthusiast group or a group that likes to grow tomatoes. They are all around us. And so that can be a great way to network and find out information. But I'd really lean back towards the Extension Service master gardeners and botanical gardens. I think they're excellent resources.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you for sharing all your knowledge today. Really appreciate it. And good luck for the rest of the year and enjoy things.
Oh, sure. Thanks. It was my pleasure to be here. It was good to talk to you.